Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 7 must-start players for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about 8 must-start prospects. 2 quarterbacks for those of you who are in desperate need of a streaming quarterback option going into the week. Of course, we would have all loved to have known that Andy Dalton was going to go for a 4 passing touchdown game last night, but we have 2 other options for those of you who are in need, considering there are 3 teams on bye that have extremely valuable quarterbacks. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and Kirk Cousins are not going to be playing this week. So we'll mention 2 quarterbacks. After that, of course, we'll talk about 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, and 4 running backs going into Week 7 that I have the utmost confidence in to set ourselves up for success and, of course, come away with a Week 7 victory. Before we get into today's video, I want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart. We officially made it to 70,000 subscribers. I mean, it was a long time coming, but I cannot thank you guys enough for the continued support. Of course, clicking that subscribe button down below, clicking the like button, commenting, of course, sharing the product that I produce on a weekly basis and daily basis for others to go ahead and consume. It's been a journey, and I cannot thank you guys enough. I truly appreciate you guys helping build the community to where it is today. Again, we're not stopping anytime soon. Don't get it twisted. Of course, we are on our way to 80,000 subscribers. So if you guys have not yet already, of course, click that like button, subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content in order to help you win a 2022 fantasy football championship. So go ahead, do yourself a favor, and subscribe today. Thank you very much. Also, after we talk about the top 8 prospects in terms of must-start players going into this week, we'll of course go ahead and travel to PrizePicks and go over a couple potential entries for this upcoming weekend. Again, via PrizePicks, you're picking more or less on a given player statistic. So in regards to players that we're talking about today, must-start prospects, of course, we're expecting them to play well and potentially surpass their overall statistic prediction that has been set on PrizePicks. So we'll go ahead, we'll travel there and put together some entries. If you guys have not yet already checked them out, there's a link down in the description. If you travel there and you want to go ahead and continue to play daily fantasy at your fingertips, of course, you can go ahead and download that on your phone or check it out on the desktop and go ahead and use promo code Andrew today. When you sign up and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you who are interested in getting involved in terms of weekly NFL entries or potentially the NBA, which recently started, or the MLB playoffs, you can go ahead, check that out. They got a bunch of other sports that we'll talk about in just a bit, but that's what we're going to be doing at the end of today's episode for those of you who are interested in some of the entries that I'm going to be making this upcoming weekend. All right, let's get into this, shall we? Beginning with our Week 7 must-start players, we're going to start with Jimmy Garoppolo. Yes, all the news around the San Francisco 49ers this week is obviously going to be surrounded by Christian McCaffrey. We had a live stream last night after the Thursday Night Football game. I gave you guys my thoughts on the matter regarding Christian McCaffrey there. So going into Week 7, I still believe, with or without Christian McCaffrey, Jimmy Garoppolo has a lot of potential upside of being a streaming option at the quarterback position, and I'll tell you exactly why. In the last 2 weeks, he's taken on the Carolina Panthers and the Atlanta Falcons. In those 2 contests in a 4-point per passing touchdown format, he's put up 18.02 and 16.94. In terms of the amount that he's had to pass the ball, and quite frankly, done it at a consistent level. Last week coming off of a 71% passing completion percentage and back-to-back weeks of over 250 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. Now, of course, Jimmy Garoppolo, he is, he's not immune to throwing interceptions. He's going to do that. That is just, ingrained in his DNA. But that's not going to bother me in any sort of capacity. That's fine. He can throw some interceptions. He's still going to be fantasy relevant considering the matchup. They take on the Kansas City Chiefs. And of course, we all know that the Kansas City Chiefs, they have given up the most points to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season on average. And they've given up, in fact, 15 passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, when you go ahead and break it down on a per game basis, sure, they've played some talented quarterbacks. Herbert, Brady, Josh Allen, Kyler Murray, Matt Ryan, and of course, Derek Carr. But every single one of those quarterbacks, at a bare minimum, put up 2 passing touchdowns against that defense. Of course, they're going to have, a couple members missing from that secondary as they're still dealing with injury. And if that's going to be the case, of course, they're giving up 21.11 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown league to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season on average. Obviously, a lot of that is skewed from the games in which Tom Brady, Justin Herbert, and Josh Allen had big performances. But even when we look at Kyler Murray, Matt Ryan, and Derek Carr, they had themselves sustainable enough games to be fantastic fantasy options and bring us home victories in that given week. That's why we're going ahead and we're firing up Jimmy Garoppolo as a streaming option. Moving on to the next option that I wanted to mention, it is Matt Ryan. We just mentioned him moments ago. He had himself a pretty good week against the Kansas City Chiefs, but now he has an opportunity of getting a little bit of revenge against his division rival in the Tennessee Titans. Now, he took them on in week 4, and in that game had 356 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns that all led up to 17.84 fantasy points. A pretty good week with a 73% passing completion percentage. And mainly, that's been the case for all quarterbacks going up against the Tennessee Titans secondary. They've given up 12 passing touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks, and they have given up 2 touchdowns per game to every single quarterback they have faced, whether it has been Daniel Jones, Josh Allen, Derek Carr, Matt Ryan, or Carson Wentz. Every single one of them have found success, and most recently, they have given up 300 plus yards to each of the last 4 quarterbacks, which is Allen, Carr, Ryan, and Wentz. So why not go ahead and continue the momentum of last week in which Matt Ryan presented to us against the Jacksonville Jaguars, where he had nearly a 73% passing completion percentage with 389 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and 27.16 4-point per passing fantasy points. Again, Matt Ryan is beginning to get into a position to find a lot of success, and the fact that we're going to potentially see Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines return to the lineup this upcoming week gives me all the confidence that they're not only going to be able to succeed on the ground, but that play action game is going to evolve and get them to the next level. This should be a fantastic game for Matt Ryan, and that is why, in my opinion, he is a streamable option going into the week. Again, as of right now, the Tennessee Titans, they're giving up the second most points to opposing quarterbacks in a 4-point per passing touchdown league, 20.18 per week. That is an unbelievable statistic, and that is why we're firing up Matt Ryan. Let's move on to Gerald Everett, the only tight end that I wanted to mention today. For those of you who perhaps have kind of fallen off the potential momentum that Gerald Everett had settled for us in the first 4 weeks of the season, I don't want you guys to 100% believe that Keenan Allen is going to take away all the value. Now, Keenan Allen presenting himself certainly does, take away targets from other receiving options, whether it be Gerald Everett and or Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler is on pace to breaking the record for most receptions in a year. I don't think he's going to get there because, again, those numbers are going to probably tilt downward. But nonetheless, I believe that Gerald Everett mainly has incredible value because of the matchup and the current circumstance within his own team. We know that for a fact, Joshua Palmer and Donald Parham, a starting wide receiver and a rotational tight end, are both going to be out with concussions this week. These are both guys that had themselves an ample amount of targets last week. I mean, Joshua Palmer had 12 of them. Now, if we go ahead and you have Keenan Allen absorbing all that value, and then you take all of the work that Donald Parham saw last week and send it in the direction potentially of Gerald Everett, we have ourselves a lot of upside, especially considering Gerald Everett even wasn't that bad last week. Yes, he wasn't able to get that much yardage, but he still had himself 7 targets and 5 catches overall. Yes, 29 yards is disappointing. But going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Seattle Seahawks, again, like I've mentioned, they have given up a boatload of points. In fact, thus far this season, are giving up 15.43 to opposing tight ends on a weekly basis in a half PPR scoring format. Just recently, of course, Zach Ertz on 10 targets, 7 catches, 70 yards. Adam Trotman, 2 catches, 32 yards, and a touchdown. TJ Hawkinson with a massive performance against them, 8 catches, 179 and 2 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts, one of his only incredible receiving games this year that didn't include a touchdown, 8 targets, 5 catches, 87 yards against his defense. Even Ross Dwelly, the week that George Kittle was out in week 2, had himself 38 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown against this defense. The Seattle Seahawks secondary hasn't been able to stop opposing tight ends as of thus far this season. And if we're going to continue to see Gerald Everett be a fixed part of this offense and not going to fade him away in any sort of capacity, considering the injuries and concussion protocol that, of course, has knocked out Joshua Palmer and Donald Parham, we're in a position here this week that we're absolutely firing him up. And if, in fact, you're in need of a tight end and maybe you see Gerald Everett available on your waivers because the last 2 performances were far too disappointing for others in your league, you should absolutely be firing him up this upcoming weekend. And also, I don't want to forget to mention that Sunday is National Tight Ends Day. There could be a lot of upside here for Gerald Everett. Let's move on to the final option on today's first half when we're talking about just regular players, not to the running back section. Running backs are coming up soon, but let's talk about Allen Lazard as the primary must-start wide receiver. For those of you who, of course, are potentially missing the services of Kupp, Allen Robinson, Adam Thielen, Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith, or potentially Gabriel Davis, Stephon Diggs, you're in desperate need of a wide receiver, and why not go ahead and potentially start either, in my opinion, of the Green Bay Packers' primary 2 wide receivers. Even though I have Allen Lazard on the screen, I think there is a very good argument for Allen Lazard and Romeo Doubs to be fantastic fantasy options. Now let's, primarily talk about Allen Lazard and what his potential looks like. Thus far this season in a half PPR scoring format, these are his first 5 performances of the year. 8.3, 12.5, 14.6, 11.5, 15.6. Now, obviously, in every single one of those games, he's either put up one receiving touchdown or had himself 100 receiving yards. So he's getting himself a huge influx of points, whether it's yardage or touchdowns, and that in itself is making the biggest difference. The fact that he's continued to see more and more air yards as the weeks have progressed, beginning in the first week that he's played in week 2, where he had 31 air yards, that went to 92, 112, 95, and just this last week had a season high of 162 air yards against the New York Jets secondary. And now he has the privilege of taking on the Washington Commanders, who last week gave up a boatload of points to Dante Pettis and Darnell Mooney. An offense that, quite frankly, isn't equipped to throwing the ball down the field at a consistent rate, yet they were able to succeed nonetheless. I think Allen Lazard is absolutely in a perfect position, coming off of 4 consecutive weeks of 10 plus fantasy points, similar to a Josh Reynolds, but in a far more competent position considering the quarterback that he is, of course, associated with, Aaron Rodgers. I know Aaron Rodgers, in terms of fantasy purposes, hasn't been at the highest level, but going forward, especially into this week, Allen Lazard has to be in every single starting lineup. Do not leave him on your bench. Now, also, I want to mention in regards to Romeo Doubs, this last week, he had himself 113 air yards himself. That was a season high as well. The 2 weeks prior had 63 and 89. Those numbers are continuing to creep forward in a positive direction for Romeo Doubs. As long as he continues to see a high volume of targets, of course, he is going to have himself immense value, especially against this Washington Commanders secondary, which we all know has struggled mightily thus far this season. All right, with that covering the first half of today's must-start players, let's go ahead and let's start talking about the running back position. Let's begin with the Dallas Cowboys running backs. Yes, I believe that we should be starting Ezekiel, Elliott, and Tony Pollard. I'm even in a position where if I have both of them on the same team, I might want to just start them both just to avoid any sort of fantasy points seeping through the cracks, because we know these 2 running backs have accounted for 100% of their team's rushing attempts this season. So going into this week, let's give you a little bit of perspective. Ezekiel Elliott from weeks 2 to 6 with Cooper Rush at the quarterback position has been averaging 17 rushing attempts, 67 rushing yards, 0.4 touchdowns, 1.2 total targets, and 1 reception per game for 10.28 fantasy points per game. Not the greatest numbers, but when you get Dak Prescott under center, you obviously continue to evolve this offense to another level. You become that much more of an efficient attack, and being able to get down into the red zone and have opportunities there is going to be far more, accessible to your team. Now, when we talk about what Tony Pollard has done from weeks 2 through 6, he's had very similar numbers, but less opportunities, averaging 10 attempts per game for 57 rushing yards, 0.4 touchdowns, 2.8 targets, 1.4 receptions, and 10.08 fantasy points per game. I believe that both of these running backs, regardless of how many touches they're going to get, the fact that even though Zeke obviously dominates far more of the overall rushing attempts, I expect both of them to have incredible games because the Detroit Lions matchup is something we cannot pass up on. As of thus far this season, the Detroit Lions have given up the most points to opposing running backs in rushing statistics alone, with 22.38 per game. That's number 1 in the league. And the fact that they've given up 117 attempts for 639 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns in just 5 games. That's a 5.46 yard per carry average against that front 7. Now, when we look at the other teams that have succeeded against this defense, of course, they haven't all been run-first approaches, but a lot of them have converted to that in this given week, in this given contest against the Detroit Lions, because they know there's a lot of success to be had. 7 running backs have scored 10 or more points against the Detroit Lions thus far this season in only 5 games. Sanders with 17.5, Gainwell with 10.2, Gibson with 11.1. Just closely behind him in that game, J.D. McKissick had 9.8, but I didn't count him, but still almost 10 points. Dalvin Cook went for 13.6, Madison 10.9, Penny 28.2, and Stevenson 18.5. There have been far too many points given up to opposing running backs thus far this season from the Detroit Lions defense for us to ignore the idea of starting both Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard as RB2s with incredible upside this upcoming week. Obviously, I've ranked Tony Pollard earlier this week as a RB3 option because, of course, Dak Prescott returns and there may be less of an opportunity to run the ball if the offense goes back to throwing. But hopefully what they have established in the last 5 games here with Cooper Rush at quarterback is that they want to rely upon the running game and, of course, play great defense. And if they're going to plug in Dak and just accentuate that even to a far greater level with play action, then we're going to be in a perfect position to have both these running backs as must-start incredible plays for the week. Let's move on to the next running back I wanted to mention. It is Damien Harris. Damien Harris had a full practice both Thursday and Friday, and that, in my opinion, automatically presents him as a must-start candidate going into Week 7. Now, the last time we saw Damien Harris, he went down with a hamstring injury against the Detroit Lions defense and unfortunately wasn't able to complete that game. And we saw Ramondre Stevenson have himself a blowout performance. And the following week, Ramondre Stevenson took over again. But now that you re-implement Damien Harris back into this offense, let me remind you just a couple weeks ago what Damien Harris was capable of doing. Many of you in yesterday's live stream even referred to the idea that Damien Harris was available on waivers in your league in some certain circumstances. So if you guys don't remember, in the 3 weeks prior to his injury, weeks 2 through 4, he put up 15.7, 11.6, and 14.9. In all 3 consecutive games from weeks 2 through 4, he scored a rushing touchdown. In those games, 15 attempts, 11 attempts, 18 attempts, all while Ramondre Stevenson was still an active part of this offense. While he was able to total 71, 41, 86 rushing yards, Damien Harris is in a perfect position to potentially pick up the number 1 running back position of this offense going into this weekend's matchup against the Chicago Bears on Monday night. I think there's an absolute guarantee that if he's going to be active, we're going to once again see this 50-50 split out of this backfield, or 40-40-20 with some other running back getting some utilization if in fact they do that. But as of right now, it's most likely in terms of touches going to be a 50-50 split between the two. And considering it is such an advantageous matchup, considering they're taking on the 4th easiest matchup of the week, the Chicago Bears giving up 17.28 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone, giving up 4.69 yards per carry on average thus far this season. It's a perfect position for Damien Harris to come back and get himself another perfect performance to help us in the given week. Let's go ahead and let's transition to Kenyan Drake. Now, unfortunately, this morning we were given information that J.K. Dobbins is going to undergo arthroscopic knee surgery that is going to hold him out to a potential of 4 to 6 weeks. Now, that recovery time is going to give another running back in this backfield an opportunity to step up. And as of last week, Kenyan Drake was that running back that stepped up first and foremost, having 10 rushing attempts against the New York Giants for 119 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 19.2 fantasy points. He had 3 rushes in that game of more than 15 yards, 2 rushes in that game of more than 30 yards. If we're going to continue to see him be a breakout player in a week in which we already have Lamar Jackson dealing with a hip injury, he may not be as willing to run the ball. They're going to have to, of course, carry the ball with their running backs and look in the direction of Kenyan Drake and Justice Hill, but primarily Kenyan Drake to carry the load. Now, luckily for them, they take on the Cleveland Browns, and the Cleveland Browns have been one of the easiest matchups at the running back position, giving up the 2nd most points to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone. 19.78 fantasy points per week and a half PPR scoring format, which consists of 126 rushing attempts, 707 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, and a 5.61 yard per carry average to opposing running backs. Just to give you some perspective, there have been 8 running backs total in 6 games that have scored more than 10 points against this defense. McCaffrey, Hall, Harris, Huntley, Algier, Patterson, very close. He had 9.8 points, didn't count him anyway. Eckler, Kelly, and Stevenson. Unbelievable performances from all these prospects. And most recently, of course, Eckler with 33.9 and Stevenson with 23.1. Those guys have been the number 1 running backs in their given weeks because of these performances taking on the Cleveland Browns defense. And though the Cleveland Browns want to go ahead and assure themselves that they're going to improve defensively in terms of stopping the run, it is going to be extremely difficult to do exactly that against the Baltimore Ravens rushing attack, as they've been one of the best in the league over the last couple of years, and they're not slowing down anytime soon. So for all the reasons I just mentioned, I believe Kenyan Drake is absolutely a must-start option going into this given week. I do also want to mention that in regards to Kenyan Drake and the potential of this backfield, considering the J.K. Dobbins news due to his injury, Gus Edwards should be picked up. If Gus Edwards is available in your league and you have an additional IR spot available to pick him up and stash him on your bench, he should absolutely be stashed because he could return at any moment. And do not forget, prior to his injury, in the first 3 years of his NFL career with the Baltimore Ravens, he has averaged over 5 yards per carry in every single one of those years. If we can go ahead and see him have a bounce back performance and immediately make an impact in this backfield, he could certainly be a fantasy prospect that we want to have stashed and ready to go when he's off the IR and designated to return. Another player that, while we're still on the topic of adding players that may not be able to help you in this week, but in potential future weeks, do not forget that Odell Beckham Jr. is eventually going to sign to a team. And if and when he does, he is going to have immense value. We saw it last year, and we're going to continue to see it in the future as long as he is associated with an offense that is going to help him get to that level. If he's going to go to the Giants, it's going to be extremely difficult for me to trust that he's going to continue to see 10 plus targets going in his direction, or at least 6 targets going in his direction, as the offense doesn't really rotate around a central number 1 wide receiver option as they really haven't all season long. But if he goes to a team like the Green Bay Packers, on the other hand, or goes to a team like, perhaps the LA Rams, they could absolutely immediately make an impact with him and elevate him to the next level. Either way, just another player that I wanted to mention. Okay, before we move on and start talking about our potential prize picks for week 7, a couple entries I wanted to go over. I wanted to go ahead and review how our week 6 results went for our must-start players. Now, in prior weeks, I went after players that were, starting in less than 30% of leagues. And there's a reason why my record is quite honestly negative, is because we were going after players that needed to be reconsidered. And yes, some of these options weren't great, yet some of them panned out to a decent extent. But last week was another L, and that's why I kind of went away from the idea of only starting players or, mentioning players that are started in less than 30% of leagues, because quite honestly, that's not sustainable, especially for us that need immediate impact. Now, unfortunately, in week 6, Benjamin had 8 fantasy points. He finishes the RB22, a decent option, but from what we saw last night, the fact that he went for 21.3 fantasy points, why didn't he do that against the Seahawks? It was a far easier matchup, but I feel like I caused bad luck on these players for some reason. I'm feeling that energy. Darrell Henderson was a decent play. He was the RB16 in the given week. Perfectly fine there. George Pickens obviously fell off as soon as Kenny Pickett went down with his concussion. Devin Duvernay was nowhere to be found in that matchup, and Taysom Hill had himself a 4-point performance when last night against the Saints puts together 9.62 fantasy points, which very easily would have been a performance we would have loved to have seen last week, but didn't end up receiving that. Either way, we're continuing to go ahead, take the results, and improve the best we possibly can. And let's go ahead. Let's move on and let's begin talking about our week 7 prize picks for this upcoming weekend. All right, so as you can see to the right side of the screen, we have our week 7 potential prize pick entries that we're going to put forth. Again, if you guys haven't traveled to PrizePicks, be sure to go down to the description and click on that link. When you travel to their website, you can go ahead, use promo code Andrew today, and when you make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So for those of you who are interested in, of course, potentially trailing, fading some of my picks for this upcoming weekend, or potentially going ahead and using your own knowledge on some of these other sports, whether it is college football, soccer, esports, tennis, golf, the NBA, the MLB, you can go ahead and put together a bunch of potential entries. I mean, they even have NASCAR, guys. NASCAR. I don't know anything about NASCAR, but hey, if you know something about NASCAR, let me know in the comment section. Maybe we could put together some entries on this upcoming weekend. But nonetheless, I wanted to talk about the NFL and potential players that we are going after. First and foremost, I want to talk some of, my overall players that I think are must-start players. Let's go ahead and begin with a player that I believe is a must-start option, Ezekiel Elliott. At this current moment in time, his more or less numbers via PrizePicks, 65.5 rushing yards, 15.5 rushing attempts, and 12 fantasy points. I think the 12 fantasy point number is something that I'm 100% willing to go more on, mainly because, think about it, 12 fantasy points in his current circumstance, under the assumption that I'm assuming he's going to score a touchdown in this given game, is a really, safe number in a full, PPR scoring format. So I'm going ahead, I'm going more on that. Now, on the other end of this coin, of course, we have Tony Pollard, his teammate, another player that I'm really comfortable potentially going with, and that's exactly why I want to bring him up on screen, because in my opinion, 9 fantasy points for him is very easily accomplishable, and quite frankly, I think he's going to eclipse that number. Now, before we go ahead and make an entry here, you got to remember that if you want to make an entry, you have to have 2 players from 2 different teams within a singular entry slip. So, if in fact we're looking for another player, let's think about Allen Lazard, a player that I mentioned just moments ago that I believe is going to have himself a pretty good, fantasy week. Let's look at the total receiving yards that he's been able to put up. Obviously, this is very, very inconsistent in his current circumstance, but the fact that he's been able to score 4 receiving touchdowns in his first 5 games this year has obviously put him in a position to succeed as of late in terms of fantasy points that he's put up. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to take Lazard, we're going to go on the more, and this is the entry that we're going to be making potentially 5 times our overall entry for the given week within these 3 players that I believe are must-start prospects going into the week. We'll make this entry and we'll continue to move on. Now, like I mentioned earlier on in today's episode, in regards to Gerald Everett, this upcoming Sunday is National Tight Ends Day. Of course, this was, deemed by George Kittle himself. So I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to make a slip that includes all tight end options. So let's go ahead. Let's go to Mark Andrews. Obviously, he's dealing with a little bit of a knee injury. I absolutely still believe that if he's healthy and playing, his history of games against the Cleveland Browns speaks volumes as to what kind of success we're going to potentially see for him this upcoming weekend in a full PPR scoring format. In 2021 against the Cleveland Browns, he put up 28.5 and 16.5 fantasy points in a full PPR. In 2020 against the Cleveland Browns defense, he was able to put up 12.8 and 22.8 fantasy points. He has found himself a lot of success against this defense. I'm going more on this option, expecting a lot of success. Of course, considering the fact that, of course, Mark Andrews has been pretty good in terms of his fantasy numbers over the course of the first month of the season plus. Obviously surpassing this number in 4 out of the last 5 games that he's put forth. And I'm going to continue with that trend. Now, another tight end that we want to mention, of course, is Travis Kelce. Another one of these players that, quite frankly, is playing just as well in terms of fantasy points. I'm taking the more on this. If I have to prove it to you, just look at what he's done as of late, continuing to put up fantastic fantasy point performances. Obviously, the number one option within this offense. Obviously, had himself a 4, receiving touchdown game against the Las Vegas Raiders, which kind of skews it in that specific game. But nonetheless, I think against this upcoming weekend's matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, National Tight End Day against George Kittle, they're obviously going to try to one-up each other. I think this is a fantastic play here. Another tight end that I wanted to mention is, of course, David Njoku. David Njoku, over the course of the last 4 weeks, has been a receiving machine within this offense, having surpassed this number of 45.5 receiving yards in the last 4 consecutive games by honestly a pretty good margin. If he continues his streak, which I'm expecting him to do so, going up against the Baltimore Ravens defense, which this team has found a lot of success in terms of throwing the ball to their tight ends over the course of the last couple of years. You go back to last season, we saw David Njoku with a 10-point game, along with Austin Hooper having his own 10-point game against that defense. There's a lot of potential success to be had here. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to make a 3-player entry here, and we're going to go ahead and put together another tight end slip that I wanted to mention right after. Now, the next tight end slip I was looking for this weekend is in regards to George Kittle going over 11.5 fantasy points. And of course, Cade Otton, who is going to be replacing Cameron Brate in terms of getting more than 27.5 receiving yards this upcoming weekend. Another one of these entries that I honestly really like going into this upcoming weekend. So again, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, be sure to go ahead, check them out today. Use promo code Andrew when you sign up and make a first-time deposit. When you do so, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. So you can go ahead, start playing, whether it is the NFL, NBA, MLB, and potentially win some money for yourselves. Again, another thing that I wanted to add on top of this, overall list is continuing to go to the fantasy point section. Considering, again, I'm not looking at a specific number of yards to expect when I'm making my ranking predictions throughout the week. I really do like to compare where these players have kind of landed over the course of the last couple weeks in terms of fantasy points and what I'm purely expecting out of them. Absolutely, without a doubt in my mind, Amon-Ra St. Brown, if DJ Chark is out, if Josh Reynolds is out, is going to be the only receiving threat that I could truly trust in this offense against the Dallas Cowboys. And quite frankly, I'm 100% in on this idea of going ahead and trusting Amon-Ra St. Brown. So we'll go ahead, make another entry here. You can go ahead and, if you'd like, search through all these different potential plays. There's a bunch of them, guys. So if you would like to go ahead and do so, click on the link down below in the description. We're going to go ahead and make this last entry and close out today's video. All right, that's going to cover it here for me today. I want to thank you guys for watching. Tomorrow, we'll be live streaming here on the channel from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Also, Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on the channel with updated rankings. So if you guys want starter sit questions Saturday afternoon, you can join us. If you'd like to get your roster set and ready to go with my updated rankings on Sunday morning, join us then. Again, I cannot thank you guys enough for helping us get to 70,000 subscribers, but we're not stopping anytime soon. Be a friend, tell a friend, and of course, continue to support the channel as much as you possibly can. I greatly appreciate you guys, and until next time, tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.